The topic that I wish to speak about today is the Book of Mormon and how the Book of Mormon is viewed, like in terms of the potential uses for the Book of Mormon. So I think that the Book of Mormon can be used as a political document to shed light on political ideas or ideas that could be described as political, but more accurately for concepts and for principles that pertain to government and to good government. So there is a perspective of the Book of Mormon that portrays it as a religious document or something that is exclusively focused on principles of religion. And I think that to some degree it is. I think that the content and the point and the usage of the Book of Mormon in a religious context is good and proper. Yet at the same time, we find that there is content and there is subject matter that defies a strictly religious limitation. So to demonstrate this point, I wanted to talk a little bit about some other foundational documents that are used within the field of political science. So for instance, in studying certain dimensions of political science and political theory, it's impossible to avoid discovering information about Socrates or about Cicero. And these are ancient political philosophers who existed within the Greek society. Their writings are taught within college courses, not to be definitive for every aspect of political theory, but they are viewed as useful and relevant to modern political questions. And oftentimes the context of modern political theory is framed in connection with ancient political theory. So Socrates is kind of an interesting figure. So the writings that we have about Socrates are not necessarily written by Socrates himself. In fact, Plato is typically given credit for writing all the information about Socrates. So the information that we have about Socrates comes from Plato, from his perspective. And so the life of Socrates is basically that he lived as a philosopher and as a popular and political figure within Greece. He was unorthodox in a lot of his methods. And the trajectory of his life is basically that he challenged the prevailing notions of political theory and sociality within Greece to such a degree that he was viewed as an enemy by the prevailing political leaders, and he was put to death. He was ultimately sentenced to death, not for any particular crime, but for the fact that he was disruptive and that he was instrumental in changing certain things within the political life. So the fact that all the information that we have about Socrates comes from Plato is described within political theory and within the experts on that field as being legitimate. However, they acknowledge that Plato might have just created Socrates out of whole cloth, that Socrates might not have necessarily been a real person. A lot of the conversations that are recorded by Plato about Socrates are given with such detail and such accuracy that it seems impossible that Plato could have actually recorded these conversations, like word for word, verbatim. The structure of the conversations is questionable, where they come across like too perfectly. And so the conclusion that many people have drawn, it's not a consensus of every academic expert within the field of political theory, but they come to the conclusion that Plato basically imagined and concocted the story of Socrates, and that many elements of it are not necessarily true or accurate. They're not necessarily historical events. And so despite this, despite the fact that the writings of Plato are questionable in their origin and in their legitimacy, they are still used. The information within them is still used as legitimate political thought. It's still viewed in a serious way where the structure and the content of those writings is taken seriously and it's used and it's applied. So to move on from the idea of Plato and to go to Cicero, Cicero is another figure within ancient political theory whose writings are taken seriously. And his writings have actually been very impactful over time. He talked about the Commonwealth within Rome, and he was able to synthesize many different political ideas in a way that people characterize as wise and very competent. At a minimum, he was a genius. He was a very good writer. However, within his writings, there's actually an interesting story that he tells, and he tells it under a pseudonym, under a different name. So it's not necessarily his actual name. It's almost a character that a lot of people within the field of political science say that he invented. and it's Scipio Africanus. The name is like Scipio Africanus. And so within the narrative that Cicero wrote concerning Scipio Africanus, he actually describes a dream that he had. And so he enters the army as a private, and he is told in a dream, one of his forefathers appears to him in a dream and tells him that although he's just entered the army here as a private and that he has a low station within the army, within 2 years, he will become the leader of the armies, and that he will eventually be instrumental in saving the Commonwealth from certain destruction and disaster. He's also told that that to that point in his life, he's borne the name of Africanus as a part of his heritage, but he was undeserving of it. And yet within due time, he will eventually bear that name rightfully and legitimately based on his own merit. So which is kind of interesting. Additionally, he describes these dreams that he would have where he was basically taken up from the earth and he was shown the earth from a larger perspective. And as he's being shown the earth by the gods, by deity, by divinity, they teach him certain things about the earth and about the nations and about the countries in the midst of this dream. And they're offering different perspectives on how to view things that occur within the earth. And at one point, they basically say to him, "Why are you so concerned about things that are happening on this planet when there are higher heavens that you can go to?" And so he goes on this journey of spirituality where he learns many things about the cosmos through deity and through divinity and through the intervention of the gods. So the point that I'm trying to make by pointing out these two authors within the film, within the field of ancient political theory, is that despite the fact that there are unorthodox elements that are contained within their writings are still viewed in a serious way as having value. The usefulness of a document like the Book of Mormon, which is also held up and scrutinized as having questionable origins by some people, is almost beside the point. I think that if we reach a point where we begin to view the Book of Mormon based on its content and based on its truthfulness according to the things that it says, rather than according to certain standards of historical legitimacy, that we can begin to use the book and determine whether or not it's useful. The question of its historical accuracy is something that places the Book of Mormon in the same category as the writings of Plato and the writings of Cicero, where all that we know is that there was a wise person who created these documents, and yet many of their origins and many of the elements of their content is questioned. Now, I would also offer an explanation for certain elements of Socrates and Plato's narratives. So the idea that Plato basically invented all of the teachings of Socrates out of whole cloth and used Socrates as a character through which he was able to communicate his own ideas is, I think, kind of a far-fetched idea. I think it's more likely that Plato legitimately knew Socrates during his life, and that Socrates was actually a person of such unique influence that the things that he said during his life stuck with Plato to such a degree that long after Socrates' death, Plato was able to remember it, because the memories of those interactions and those conversations was so vibrant and so impactful in a unique and in a special way that Plato was able to keep those memories and eventually transpose them onto paper. So the question of whether or not every single word in every single conversation and every discourse of Socrates occurred, in my perspective, is beside the point, because I believe that Plato genuinely had these interactions with Socrates, that Socrates was a real person, that the information that he was able to convey to Plato and to others was so impactful and so notable and so remarkable that Plato was able to remember it. And so in my view, we can view the writings of Plato about Socrates as being accurate. Additionally, it's interesting to point out that certain things that Socrates mentioned within his own story are inseparable from religious sentiment. So for instance, Socrates said that when he had reached a certain age, that he was at the temple, and the oracle at the temple had said to him, within like a dream of divinity, had said to him, "Socrates, you are the wisest person in all of this land." So Socrates said that based on the fact that the oracle had said that to him, he ventured forth on his ministry and he began to speak to people because he was at the temple. and someone had said something to him at the temple, which he viewed as coming from divinity, from deity, and so he acted on that. There are many other elements of Socrates' own story where he describes hearing a still small voice, or the voice of his conscience, which would speak to him and which would give him guidance and instruction on what he should say and how he should say it. And he deliberately references this as being part of the source of the information and the wisdom and the instruction that he was able to bring forth. Additionally, there was a point in Socrates' life, toward the end of his life, where he mentioned a dream that he had, where he was told that he would die in 3 days' time. And so he said that he had a dream, and the person appeared to him in a dream and said, within 3 days' time, like, you will be in paradise. So I think that these references, these explicitly religious ideas that can be construed in no other context than religious experience, gives additional credibility to the type of document that the Book of Mormon is. Because the Book of Mormon contains all of these elements. It contains all of these things of people having religious experience and of receiving revelation from higher sources, which gives them wisdom and instruction, which is then usable and which is then useful. So the proposition that I would make is that the Book of Mormon should be placed in a category of relevant ancient political theory. And if not ancient political theory, then modern political theory. That if we view Hume, the writings of David Hume or of Ralph Waldo Emerson as being useful within their own sphere to study and to reference for information, then at a minimum, even if Joseph Smith did create this, there's still a level of wisdom and genius and usefulness contained within it. But I would also assert at the same time that I doubt that its origins are questionable. That I think it does come from an authentic source, and that there is the effort of deity and divinity of God to inspire people throughout time and throughout the ages to create documents and manuscripts of instruction and intelligence that are useful to us in our own sphere. So in conclusion, I would just say that I think that far too often we trifle with such a valuable document as the Book of Mormon while we hold writings of Socrates or Plato or Cicero or these other things in high esteem. And we ought to correct the errors that we have made in the way that we view the Book of Mormon and elevate it to its rightful and proper stature as a document of truth and of useful instruction.